Hello and welcome to yet another tutorial by Davies Media Design. My name is Michael Davies, and in today's tutorial I'll be showing you how to create a 3D isometric phone design using Inkscape. But of course, before we get into that, I want to direct you guys over to my website at daviesmediadesign.com. As always, we have tons of GIMP and Inkscape tutorials and help articles on here, so definitely check that out. And don't forget to check out my brand new Inkscape help articles section if you want to further expand your Inkscape knowledge. And of course, you can support my channel and help me grow by becoming a patron on Patreon. And I'll include a link to this as well as all the relevant links from this tutorial in the description of the video. Alright, so here is my final 3D cell phone isometric design. And this design is really great to use to represent something like an app design or, a user interface on a cell phone. It has many applications, and that of course is up to you, that application. So let's dive in here to this tutorial, and I'm going to start by coming over here and going to File, New. And that's going to create a new document here in Inkscape. If I hold Control and zoom out, you guys will notice that I have a dark gray background here and then my canvas is white. I did set up my default canvas to look like Adobe Illustrator's Artboard by default, and I have an Inkscape help article on how to do that, so check that out if you want your canvas to look like mine here. Once I've created my new document, the next thing I need to do is create my grids, and we are going to use two grids for this tutorial. The first is going to be a standard rectangle grid, and the second is going to be an isometric grid. So I'm going to start by coming over here and going to File, Document Properties, and that'll bring up this Document Properties window here. I'm actually going to click right here and drag this over here because this is a dockable dialog, so I'll just drop it right over here, and that's going to make this a little bit more easily accessible as I work. And now I'm going to come over here to Grids. You can see here we have the option to create a rectangle grid, and I'm just going to click New, and that's going to create my new grid. And I'm going to keep everything set to the default, so my origin X and Y are going to be 0, my spacing X and Y are going to be 1. You can change the color of your grid if you want, and I'm going to keep the major grid line every 5 pixels here. So there is our rectangle grid, but we also need our isometric grid, so that's really easy to create. We're going to come over here under Creation, and we're just going to change this to axonometric grid, which is just how Inkscape describes the isometric grid. And now I'm going to click New. So there is our isometric grid. The problem is right now, if I hold Control and zoom in with my mouse wheel, these grids are interacting with each other, so it kind of looks like a big mess and it's hard to see what's going on. So I'm going to come over here to this tab right here, which is Grid 2830. And this is our axonometric grid, and I'm just going to uncheck the enabled option here. We can always come back and enable this later, which is exactly what we're going to do. But for now, we just need the rectangle grid, the rectangular grid, which is going to be our grid 2828. So now I can start by drawing my rectangle. So I'm going to come over here and grab my rectangle tool, and I'm just going to click and draw a random rectangle. Right now it doesn't matter too much, but this will be a phone, so you want this to be relatively the same proportions as a typical phone that you would use. So whatever you want that to be, you can make it skinnier if you want to make it skinnier, but in this case I'm just going to go with about this size right here. And by the way, I do have my snap to grids option on, and that's just going to ensure that the lines I draw snap to the various parts of my grid. That way I don't have to eyeball this and guess at whether or not I'm aligned on the grid. So make sure you have that option checked there. And I don't need the document properties right now, so I'm just going to click right here to move that down here, and I can access that later. And I can just move this in a little bit so it's not taking up so much room. Alright, so here is our rectangle shape, and right now it is sort of this blue color. I want this to be more of a black color for right now, and then we're also going to change that a little bit later. So I'll just use my swatches panel down here to change this to black. And now I'll grab my selection tool, and right now we have these transform handles here which allow us to scale, but what I need to do is I need to access the ability to round the corners of this rectangle. And to do that, all I have to do is double click on here, and up here you have RX and RY. These are your values for your rounded corners. So you can see right now these are rounded to 5 pixels. I'm actually going to increase this to 40. So I'll just highlight both the RX and RY and change those to 40. Hit the tab key. And now you can see we have rounded corners. I'm going to grab my selection tool again, and I'm going to come over here to Align and Distribute. If you don't have it opened up yet over here, you can just come over here and click the Align and Distribute Objects icon. And now I'm going to align this relative to the page. So I'll center align that there vertically and center align it horizontally. So now this is nice and centered. Next, what I want to do, I want to make sure I'm clicked on this, and then I'm going to hit Control D to duplicate that. And I'll change the color of this to, let's go with like a light gray, so 30% gray for now. And now I'm going to drag this inward while I hold the Shift key. That's going to ensure it drags from the center. And now I can sort of adjust this until I get a pretty solid width on this. So let's go with, and this is snapping to the grid, that's why it's kind of being a little bit erratic there. And I actually think this is a little bit too small, so I'll just drag that out. And then of course we can align that again. And I'm going to use these handles right here to just drag this inwards a little bit because we need room for the home button that's going to go down here. So now I want to remove the rounded corners on here because I just think the screen looks a little bit better, a little bit more realistic without the rounded corners. So to do that, I'll just double click on this, and I can come over here and click this icon here to make the corner sharp once again, and that'll remove the rounded corners. I'll grab my selection tool. I do want to just bring this down a little bit. I think it goes a little bit too high up here towards the top, so that looks pretty good. Now I'm going to grab my ellipse tool here, or my circle tool, and I'll hold Control and Shift and just draw a circle, and this is going to allow me to draw a perfect circle. I don't want it to be too big, but I also don't want it to be too small, so this is snapping to the grid here, so it's kind of being a pain. But I'll hold Control and zoom in a little bit here. That way we can get some smaller grids going here, or smaller squares on the grid. And now I can grab one of these transform handles, hold the Control and Shift keys, and now I can have a little bit more control over the size here. So I think that looks pretty good there. It's up to you guys how big or small you want that to be. And now I'm just using the arrows on my keyboard to move this into place, and then I can also use the center align button here to make sure that's nice and center aligned. And if you want, you can always move this to snap to the grid here like so. So that is snapping right here to the top part of the grid. And I'll hold Control and zoom out. All right, so next I want to put a speaker up top here and that little front-facing camera. So I'm going to grab my rectangle tool again, hold Control and zoom in a bit here. And now I'm just going to draw a pretty thin rectangle. So I'll go with 2 grids or 2 squares in the grid for now. It's basically 2 pixels. And I'm going to go with about right there. That's a little bit too large, so I'm actually just going to shrink this down to a single pixel square, like so. I'm going to move it down a little bit to about right here, so we have, actually I'll go with about right here, so we have room for the camera. I like the original placement better right there. And I'm going to click here to align this to the center of the page vertically. And then I'll double click on this to bring up my rounded corner options again, because I do want this to be slightly rounded. So I'll change the RX and the RY to 5. And when I click off it, you can see now it has a bit of a rounded edge here, and that makes it look more like the speaker. Now we'll draw the front-facing camera, so that will just be the circle tool again, and I'll hold Control and Shift to draw a perfect circle. And this one doesn't have to be that large. I think that looks pretty good right there. And we can hold Control and zoom in to make sure this is aligned on the grid, which it pretty much is. And then we can also center this vertically. So hold Control and zoom out because I do want to see how this looks from afar. And that's looking pretty good. I think I'm going to actually bring these down a little bit. So I can click on this object here and then shift click on this one as well. And we can move both of these objects together. And maybe hold Control and zoom in and just click and drag with the mouse. Hold Control and zoom out. And that looks pretty good. All right, now that we have our shapes in place, I now want to go through here and make sure the colors are the way I want so that the phone looks a little bit more realistic. You can keep this as a black phone if you want. I'm gonna change this to white. So what I'll do is I'll click on the main body of the phone and change this to a white color. And then I'm gonna come over here and grab my gradient tool. And I'll come up here and make sure that my gradient is on the stroke. And actually also I wanna change the gradient style from radial to linear. Once I've done that, I'm going to click and drag from the top left down to the bottom right. And that is going to create a gradient on the stroke of my object here. And what I can do is come over here to Fill in Stroke, which you can access by going to Shift Control F, or you can come over here and go to Object, Fill in Stroke. But once we have our gradient here, we can change the colors by just clicking on the ends of the gradient. And I'm going to hold Control and zoom in. I actually want to change the width of my gradient first. So let me come over here and just type 15 for the width and hit the Tab key. So I'll hold Control and zoom out. And let me actually shrink that a little bit more. So I'll use 10 this time. That looks pretty good. So I can change the colors of the gradient by clicking on the ends of the gradient and then just coming over here and clicking on my swatch. So I think 30% gray looks pretty good. Let me come up here and change this to maybe 50% gray. And I can also try 60% gray. I can also change these colors later if we realize we don't like them. So that looks pretty good. And I also want to add a gradient to the circle here, the home button. And so I'll just grab my gradient tool as well. I can keep all the settings the same because I do want this to have that same dark gray to light gray coloring going on here. That'll help it match, you know, just the phone, the outline of the phone. And I'll grab my selection tool once again. So there is our home button. All right, this looks pretty good. What I'll do now is I'll come over here to my document properties and I'm just going to turn off the regular rectangle grid. And now I'll come over here to grid 2830 and just enable that axonometric grid or the isometric grid. And so now we have that isometric grid here. And next I'm going to hit Control A to select everything on my canvas. And I'll hit Control G to group everything. So now all this is basically acting as one object right now. Next what I'll do is I'll go to Object, Transform. And I've already got my transform option open over here, so it's opened up below. Let me just minimize the document properties for now, and now I have my transform options open here. And I'm just going to bring this inward a little bit. So our axonometric grid or our isometric grid by default is going to be set at a 30-degree angle. So we want everything that we're creating to be on that same angle, and that's just going to give this that isometric perspective and allow us to make this look 3D. So we're keeping that in mind when we're transforming this. So what we need to do is we need to skew this so that it has a 30-degree skew, and then we need to rotate it so that it's properly positioned on the grid, and that's what we're going to do with the transform option here. So the order of this does matter, so you want to skew this first always, and then you want to rotate it, otherwise it's going to look messed up. So I'll come over here to skew, and for now I want to skew this, but I actually don't want to skew it by 30 because it's going to make it go to the left here, and that's the wrong direction, at least for what I want to do. So I'm actually going to skew this by -30 degrees, and you can see our unit right here is already set to degrees, so we're going to keep it set to that. And I only want to set the horizontal skew to -30. I don't want to touch the vertical. So I'll come over here and hit -30 and then click apply. And now you can see that will skew our design by -30. And because we grouped all of the objects together, they all skew together. But obviously this looks a little bit weird, and instead of manually rotating this, I already know I want to rotate it by 30 degrees. So I'll come over here to the rotate option, and this I'm also going to set to -30 degrees. And hit apply. And you can see that when we do that, it sets this nicely on our isometric grid here. So it looks pretty good. And what I'll do is come down here to align, and I'm just going to make sure this is vertically and horizontally centered aligned, which it is. And I'll hold Control and zoom in a little bit. But now I'm going to hit Control Shift G to ungroup everything and click off of that. And the reason I want to do that is that I want to select only the main background of the phone, this portion right here. I'll hit Control Z. And after I've selected that, I'm going to hit Control D, and that's going to duplicate that. And now I want to make this the color of the main body of the phone, and that's going to be the part that's going to look 3D. So we need to change the foreground color and the stroke color, and I'm just going to go with a light gray so it looks sort of metallic. We're actually going to change this a little bit later, but we'll go with light gray for now. And then I'll shift click on that same light gray color because we want to cover up the stroke there. Without this actually looking like it has a stroke, that's not really going to matter too much later. You'll see why. But once we have this, a solid gray color, I can hit Control D, and that's going to duplicate my shape. I'll hit Control Z, so you can see now we have two of the same shape here. And I'll click on that top shape, and then I'm just going to use my downward arrow to move this down in a straight line. We want to keep this on the isometric grid, and the amount that you move this downward depends on how thick you want your phone to look. I'll go with about right here. So if I hold Control and zoom in, you could see, how far down on the grid I went. So not really far, but far enough to make this look nice and 3D. And once I've done that, I'm going to shift click on the top object. So now we have the bottom and the top object selected. And I'm going to come over here and go to path, object to path, and that'll convert both of these objects to paths. And then I'll come over here to extensions, generate from path, and go to interpolate. And I'm going to set this to 1 for the exponent, 100 for the interpolation steps, and 1 for the interpolation method. Interpolation steps is just how many times this is going to be duplicated, the shape in between the two shapes. Because we don't have very far to go, I only need to set this to probably 100, and I'll click apply. All right, so now we've blended the two shapes together to create sort of one large looking shape. I'm going to exit out of this, and before I go any further, I do want to save this composition real quick. I had a problem earlier with Inkscape where it crashed on me. So I'm just going to come over here and go to File, Save As, and I'm just going to save this as Isometric Phone Design. Make sure it's set to SVG, which stands for Scalable Vector Graphics, and hit save. And we can just continue working now. And just save as we go to make sure that we don't lose any of our work if this crashes. All right, so we have our blended shape here to create what is going to be the 3D portion of the body of the phone. I'll hit Control-Z to bring that back. So I have that shape selected here. What I need to do is go to Control-Shift-G, or Object Ungroup, and that is going to ungroup all my objects. And now I'm going to go to Path Union, and that'll just merge all of those different objects or those different paths together to create one single object. And for the next part here, I'm just going to change the color of this to red, and also come over here and shift click on the stroke to get rid of that stroke. And the reason I'm making this red is because I'm going to move this down in the stacking order, but because right now it is the same color of those two shapes we created originally, those duplicate shapes, it's going to be kind of hard to differentiate this new shape we created from the other shapes, so just making it red makes it easier to differentiate. And we're going to delete those other shapes in a second here, but I'm just going to hit page down to move that below the two shapes we created, and now you can see why we made that color red. And so I'm going to zoom in here. So the main issue is I got rid of the stroke that was on here, and the reason being that I need to add a gradient to this in a second, and if I have the stroke, it's just going to complicate the gradient. So I got rid of the stroke, and now the problem is that that caused this to shrink down in size. So this is no longer the same size of the shape of my phone. So I'm just going to use the transform handles here to drag these outward and match it to the size of these two original shapes. And I can come down here using my mouse wheel and just the bars right here to move around my image. And now I'm just going to use the transform handles to align this. So you can see we're aligning both the left portion here and trying to align this portion. So I'll hold Control and zoom out a bit so I can grab this handle, move it down. And we can always adjust this a little bit later to make sure it's fitting a little bit better. But I do want to get this as close as possible for right now, so that looks pretty good. So I'll hold Control and zoom out, and hold Control and zoom in with my mouse wheel, and just match this last part up here right there. So that looks pretty good. So now we're nice and aligned. I'm going to click on this shape. This is our original gray shape, and just delete that. Click on this top shape, delete that, using the backspace key. And then I'm going to click on our whole shape here and just hit the page down button on my keyboard, and that's going to allow me to move that all the way down below our main phone design. So now you can see the 3D aspect of our phone is starting to take shape here. Now what we need to do is just change the color of this to a gradient, and that's going to just, again, allow this to look more 3D, make it look like the light is hitting it and therefore causing one part to be a little darker and the other part to be a little bit lighter. And so I'll grab my gradient tool here, and we're still clicked on this back shape here, so I'm just going to click and drag this. And actually, let me hit Control-Z. I do need to change my gradient up here. Right now it's still set to draw in the stroke. I want to draw this in the fill. So I'll make sure that option is checked, and then I will click and drag this here inside of the bottom portion of the phone. And I can always bring the gradient down so it aligns on the grid. Now we want to change the color of our gradient, so I can start with this left portion of the gradient, and I'll just change this to a lighter gray, and then I'll click on the right portion of the gradient and make this a darker gray. You can see the color down here as I'm hovering over it. So we'll go with a darker gray there. That looks pretty good. So I will click off of that, All right, we have the main portion of our phone done. I'm just going to add a couple of pieces to this to bring out some more details in here. And to do that, I'm going to grab my rectangle tool once again, and I'll hold Control and zoom in a little bit. And I'm just going to draw a pretty thin rectangle. And actually, let me come over to my document properties and just turn off the isometric grid real quick and turn back on the regular grid. And now I'm going to click and drag and make a speaker, or at least what looks like a speaker here. And you can see I made this, about the size of 2 of these grid squares here, so it's not very big. But what I need to do is grab my select tool, and while I'm clicked on this, I'll hit Control D. That will duplicate this. And then I'm going to move this up a little bit. So we're pretty much just moving this up and over by 1 square, one of the big squares here on the grid. And I'll hold Control and zoom out a little bit. I'm going to make this a little bit lighter of a gray color, and I actually need to just move this down and over a little bit. I don't want it to go over that much. And once I've done that, I'm actually going to click on this bottom one again and hit Control D again to duplicate that. And then I'm going to shift click on the top dark gray rounded rectangle here and the lighter rounded rectangle. And then I'll come over and go to Path, Object to Path, and then Path, Intersection. And now you can see what that's done is it's created this look where it looks kind of like it's sunken in a little bit, and that's what our speaker is going to look like. It looks like our speaker is inset on the phone, so it just makes it look a little bit more realistic there. And now I'm going to click on this first object and then shift click on the second object and go to Control G to group those objects. And I'll hold Control and zoom out. And once our objects are grouped, I'm going to come over here and just hide the rectangle grid. And now I'm just going to show the axonometric grid. And then I can minimize that. And of course, let me just move this over a little bit so we have some more room. Then I'll come back over here to the transform option, which of course you can access by going to Object, Transform. And I'll come over here and I'm going to do the skew first. So I'll skew this by -30 again and hit apply. And then I'll come over here to rotate, and I'm going to rotate this by -30 again, hit apply. Now I can use my selection tool to just drag this into place, and it should snap to the grid here. And we want to make this be as aligned or as center aligned as possible here. So if I click off, you can see that looks pretty center aligned, and now it looks like we have a speaker down there. And the last thing I'm going to do is add some volume buttons over here to the side. So I'll hold Control and zoom in. I'll grab my ellipse tool and hold Control and Shift, and now I'm just going to draw a small circle here, about that size. And I can change the color just by clicking on here. So let's go with a 50% gray for the main, and then shift click and do maybe a 20% gray for the stroke. And of course I can come over here to fill in stroke, and let's just change the stroke size to something small like 5. That looks pretty good. I'll grab my select tool again and hit Control D to duplicate that. And I'm just going to click and drag the duplicated object and hold Control to drag it in straight line mode. And I'm just going to put these a decent distance apart, but not too far apart, so about right there looks good. And then I'm going to hold the Shift key and click on the second object, go to Control G to group that. And I'll come back here to my transform option. And now I'll come up here to skew. And I want to skew this by -30 again, so I'll hit apply. But when we're rotating this, because it's on the other face of the phone, I don't want this to be rotated at -30. I just want this to be rotated at 30, so I'll get rid of the negative and hit apply. And that will properly rotate this. So now I can drag this over here onto the side of the phone and just place that about right here, maybe a little bit lower on the phone, so about right here. Hold Control and zoom out. And now if I come back over here to my document properties, I can hide that axonometric grid and just go ahead and exit out of that because we don't need it anymore, and just move this a little bit out of the way. So here is our final phone design. All right, so that's it for this tutorial. Hopefully you liked it. If you did, you could subscribe to my YouTube channel at youtube.com/daviesmediadesign. You can visit my website at daviesmediadesign.com, and you can support our channel and help us grow by becoming a patron on Patreon. And I'll include a link to that as well as all the relevant links from this tutorial in the description of the video. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.